Michael Vannen, and welcome to the Palantir podcast, the broadcasting arm of GHG Palantir, a Tolkien discussion group which meets solely online, connecting many people from around the world. We are connected to the Grey Havens Group, a nonprofit out of Denver which promotes literacy. Find out more about us by searching on Facebook or go to greyhavensgroup.org. Due to some technical difficulties, I wasn't able to record a podcast for Chapter 7 of the Silmarillion. We've continued on through Chapter 7 and into Chapter 8. The two are relatively short and actually tie one into the other. In Chapter 7 of Feanor and the Unchaining of Melkor, we meet the primary protagonists of the story, the Quenta Silmarillion. Primarily, the high family, the head family, if you will, of the Noldor, whose head is Finwë, who marries Miriel, who gives birth to Feanor. Feanor is also known as Finwë, and is named Feanor by his mother. Feanor means spirit of fire. She is basically worn out by his birth and states to her husband Finwë that the energy that would have gone into multiple sons has all gone into one. She essentially dies, and Finwë marries another and has two other children, Fingolfin and Finarfin. One of the things that we talked about quite a bit in this particular chapter is the loss of a feminine influence on Feanor, and how that potentially mars his character greatly and is a handicap for him being a truly socially healthy person. Also in this chapter, we have the Unchaining of Melkor. The passage of the 3 ages he was imprisoned in Mandos is finished, and he is set free. After he is set free, he feigns repentance and goes among the Eldar with the purpose of corrupting them and finding out more about them, and essentially trying to wheedle his way in. One of the things that comes out of this chapter is the problem of the Noldor. The problem of having a race of beings so utterly curious and so desirous of knowledge, and being brought to Valinor by the Valar with perhaps too little instruction, too little life experience, too little to really ground them in any kind of morality or responsibility to understand that there is a certain level of responsibility tied into curiosity, into discovery, into creation. Rather, they are very much a naive set of characters who go about creation and discovery for that sake, without any real understanding of consequences or what may come. As a group, we discussed how this is very similar to scientific discovery in the primary world, with the discovery of radiation or various other means of transportation, engines, artillery, things of that nature, which perhaps in their beginning would have had a healthful benefit for the human race, but were soon turned to negative uses for warfare, for hurt. The same is also true to a large degree with the Noldor. They make great strides in the creation of gems and beautiful things. And though it doesn't initially lead to the creation of weaponry or warfare or murder or anything of that nature, it does lead to a change in their character. They harden their hearts and become a prideful race. Though you can argue part of this is under the influence of Melkor, seen in both chapters 7 and 8, and their feeling that these creations of their own volition, of their own knowledge, their own achievement, rather than of the combined achievement of them and the Valar, they become prideful. They turn away from cooperation with the Valar. They turn away from living with towards a perceived living under. It kind of comes back to this idea with Feanor, the spirit of fire, someone who is so incredibly gifted in pretty much every way. Is he like a sort of rich kid who is given so much and yet understands so little? Who is spoiled and hasn't learned how to handle the gifts that have been given to him? They're given power, but they're not given wisdom. They don't understand. It's kind of also like when you have an intern in an office, or when you begin to start a new field of work or field of study. One of the things that you'll quickly discover is that you need to have a certain base of knowledge before you can even understand the questions that need to be asked. And even then, there are sure to be questions that you don't even know of the existence of, don't have the frame of reference for, and yet will be the pitfall because you didn't ask them. That wisdom is missing. That knowledge is neglected. And in part, this lays the seeds for the fall of the Noldor. And we can't wholly put the blame of this on Melkor, because we have a case where the Valar have brought the Noldor here, have taught them, have sponsored them, and brought them to this level of knowledge, and shared with them their own knowledge, which perhaps they shouldn't have, without really truly trying to understand what that knowledge means, or what it could lead to, or trying to give the Noldor the proper foundation on which that knowledge should rest. And perhaps this is simply a naivete on the part of the Valar, that they do not really truly understand the nature of the Eldar. One of the interesting things about the death of Muriel is that she appears to see a doom coming. She appears to have some level of prescience and knowledge that her son, in his greatness and in his genius, may also be the downfall. There is a very thin line between genius and insanity. One of the things that we discussed at great length during this particular meeting of Feanor and the Unchaining of Melkor is the nature of Feanor as a literary character. He is absolutely devoted and wrapped up in his creation and in the oath he takes for its preservation. He has a one-track mind. And his motivation, in large part, is simply lust and greed. It also potentially is a need for prominence, a need for attention. But he holds to this notion that the Silmarils can be in no one else's hands but his own or that of his children. He has a singular focus. And in many ways, he acts as the catalyst which brings upon Middle-earth all of the tragedies which are to follow. He is, in a sense, a doomed character. Where else have we seen this sort of character? In contemporary or modern literature, there are very few who even begin to approach this level of focus, and focus which is often incredibly negative. Interestingly enough, we landed on Severus Snape in the Harry Potter series, who is an enigmatic character where we can't really sense if his motivations are purely good or evil. We can't really sense if everything he's doing is out of his oath of protection for Harry, out of love for Lily, or if in part some of these actions are selfish, if some of these actions are evil, if some of these actions are under the auspices of Voldemort or under the auspices of Dumbledore. We don't really know. And the same uncertainty is wrapped into the character of Feanor. We can't really say, although it appears on the surface that he is a purely evil character. And this is something we brought into the light with our discussion of Chapter 8. Is who is Feanor? Why might he act the way he does? And it's a critical question, and one that needs to be answered in the mind of the reader before they really can continue through the meat of the rest of the First Age. Because it's the difference between seeing Feanor as someone who potentially orchestrated, intentional or not, the essential massacre of his own people, the duping of his own people, the corruption of his own people, or someone who himself has been duped. Someone who himself, through his own brokenness, through his own woundedness, has led to the destruction of the world, destruction of the age. Chapter 8 of the Silmarils and the Unrest of the Noldor really gets into the beginning of the story. It's still relatively high level and glossing over a lot of the detail, but in giving us mainly a summary of the events. We have the creation of the Silmarils by Feanor. They lock within them, in a body of crystal, the light of the two trees. They are hallowed and made holy by Varda. And Mandos decrees that the fate of the world is tied up in them. Feanor, of course, loves and lusts after these Silmarils, which are his own creation. Melkor does as well, and longs to claim ownership of them. He spends the majority of this chapter seeding doubt and seeding rumor among the Noldor, not to Feanor, but rather to those around him, such that these rumors can reach him. And he speaks through half-truths, through lies of omission, telling mostly the truth but leaving critical information out. He tells the Noldor of the coming of the men, who will supplant them in power in the earth and take over Middle-earth and deny them kingship. Eventually this reaches Feanor, and the rebellion begins in earnest. The Noldor begin crafting weapons, only visible through their carrying of shields. They begin to form factions, primarily between the House of Feanor and the House of Fingolfin and Finarfin. Feanor feels an intense jealousy towards his half-brothers of any attention that they receive, particularly from his father. And so the seeds of the destruction which will follow are set. Eventually, Feanor comes and brandishes his sword at Fingolfin, which leads to his exile from Tirion Antuna, the main city of the Noldor, and he houses himself away for 12 years, exiled by the Valar in Formenos. His father goes with him there. Melkor comes and tries to tempt Feanor into further rebellion, but overplays his hand, and Feanor becomes aware of his lust for the Silmarils. Melkor flees out of Valinor, and messengers from Feanor to the Valar are too late to catch him. So there's a period of reprieve following this chapter in which, to some degree, the corruption we've seen at least doesn't necessarily accelerate. But it is definitely the twilight of the bliss of Valinor. Part of Feanor's problem is that he isn't well liked. He is very much a singular character. He is very much someone who's walking that line, so common among those who are creative, so common among those who are smart to the genius level, between genius and insanity, genius and being a sociopath. His brothers, half-brothers rather, Fingolfin and Finarfin, are very well liked. And he's heard rumors that they're even going to try to supplant him within the succession of the rulership of the Noldor. And it only makes matters worse that when he's exiled, I believe it's Fingolfin ends up on the high seat, since Finwë has followed him to Formenos. One of the things we begin to see with this particular chapter, chapter 8, is one of the words that Tolkien begins to use over and over again in the Silmarillion. It doesn't so much pop up in The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, and yet it appears to be a common theme throughout all of his written work in Middle-earth. That word is thrall, thraldom, or enthrall. And when you look it up in the dictionary, one of the meanings, which seems particularly fitting for Tolkien's work, is to someone who is morally or mentally enslaved by some power, influence, like, appetite, or desire. It also has the more known meaning, which we all know, of enslavement, physical enslavement more often than not. However, that does not get at the heart of the subtlety of what we see here. Because what we see here is enthrallment on all levels. The Noldor are enthralled by their need for knowledge, by their curiosity. They are enthralled to that desire, and later are enthralled by Melkor into this hatred, into this resentment of the supposed imprisonment, of the supposed kidnapping, if you will, of them away from Middle-earth and their rightful claim. They are sucked into it. It consumes them. By the other token, the Valar are also enthralled. They are enthralled by the Eldar, fascinated by them. They love them. They adore them. They want to care for them and protect them. All reasons why they wanted to bring them to Valinor in the first place. Not to imprison them, but so that they might delight in their presence and delight in teaching them what they know. They are both, the Valar and the Eldar, in a state of enthrallment, enthralldom. And we will see this thralldom take on many forms throughout the entire course of the Silmarillion, and even The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings in the case of the rings, and the idea of being a possessor versus a possessee. Do the things you create, do your interests possess you? Or do you possess them? Is it a healthy thralldom of love, of interest, of care, of curiosity, of thirst for knowledge? Or is it taken to the negative extreme, whereby it leads to resentment, lying, greed, avarice, a search for power and domination? Therefore, we can look at this word, which we haven't really seen so far in the Silmarillion, but plays a critical role in the Quenta, as perhaps one of the central themes of all of Tolkien's writing. And its healthy and its unhealthy aspects. Not only in a physical form, or even a mental or spiritual form, which we see in the thralldom of the Noldor after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, but also in the character's thralldom to their desires, to their obsessions, to their wants. And we can begin to see then, with the interrelationship of characters, how this affects each and every one of them and how they relate one to the other. As I discussed with regards to the previous chapter, the Valar appear very naive in teaching the Noldor and expanding their knowledge. But we have to remember that the Valar are essentially spiritual or angelic beings which exist outside of time. Though they know time, and though they exist in time in Arda, they are not of time. They existed before and will exist after time, unlike the Eldar and unlike the men which are to follow. They have some concept of time. We saw this with Yavanna and the concept of She potentially would look at time not in minutes and seconds and hours and days, but in the lifespan of a fly, in the lifespan of a cat, in the lifespan of an elephant, of a tree, so on and so forth. Their understanding of time would be completely different. Even Varda, even more so. If you look in terms of the billions of years that a star may be in existence before it burns out. And to a certain degree, they exist in a certain level of timelessness, such that an understanding of the resentments of the Noldor is impossible. Because the Noldor move through a progression in which they are at first grateful and willing learners, students at the feet of the Valar, to feeling as if they have taught themselves and achieved this pinnacle of their own volition, by their own skill, and surpassed even the Valar in power and might. And the idea that someone could potentially forget, or move beyond, or pile more information on, and therefore mar or cloud the past, seems like it's potentially something that Valar would not understand. Because how can a timeless figure understand the concept of forgetting? How can a timeless figure understand the concept of not knowing the past, the present, and the future all at once? And therefore, it's not only naivete, it's not only trust, but one of the things we need to remember throughout the body of this work, two things. Elves, men, and the Valar, though sentient beings, do not think, do not live, do not function in the same way. They can't. They are intrinsically different beings. And though we come at it from the standpoint of humanity, though we come at it from the standpoint of elves, because those are the beings we're to understand, transmit this knowledge to us, we cannot, by the nature of these characters and who and what they are, truly understand what they can understand of each other and what their motivations are. We are hearing through the passage of time, given the narrative device that Tolkien has set up here, the annals of the elves. This is the interpretation of the elves through time of what has occurred, and their interpretation of the Valar. Is it the fullness of it? It can't be. And so when we look at this, we need to understand that there's much more to this story than we can ever reach or understand. We are essentially getting a history in the truest sense of the word. One of the common phrases out there is that history is written by the victors. You can argue that the elves, by any stretch of the imagination, are not victors, after all the tragedies that they go through in the First Age. However, the main point of that quote is that the peoples who write history imprint on it their own views, their own interpretations, their own understanding of events. And therefore, when we read the Silmarillion, it is very important to read it with a grain of salt and understand that there is, or at least is implied to be, a certain level of an agenda. And it kind of comes back to the question of how far do you think Tolkien took this? How far do you think he could have taken it? Based on his letters, based on HOME, History of Middle-earth, it would seem that some of this, at least, is definitely present. And definitely this idea of the natures being different and the natures being non-interchangeable is there. It's curious, moving on, that the exile of Feanor is for 12 years. I've just finished this discussion. We had just finished this discussion of the nature of the Valar and how they don't truly understand time, or can't truly understand time, on the same level as the Eldar or on the same level as men. We know by this point that, of course, this is being reported to us by elves who would understand minutes, hours, days, and so on and so forth. But why 12? Well, one of the interesting linkages that one of us brought up is the idea of the continued nature of time, the continued nature of existence being wrapped up in those initial moments of the music of the Ainur. And there are 12 pitch notes in an octave. So we are still, whether this is the source or not, we can still see remnants of the music trickling through. When the Silmarils are made, we aren't really given a clear description of how they're made. In Tolkien's earlier writing, he does give a fairly long and detailed description of the elements that go into the making. Instead, all we are really told is that they contain the light of the two trees, and we are told over and over again, with regards to the making of the Silmarils, as well as with regards to the knowledge of the Noldor, that they have forgotten the source. That Feanor has forgotten the source of the light, that this light is of the two trees and not of his own making. And this is critical. It is critical to understanding their corruption. They lack this memory, this gratitude for the source, for the wellspring of their talents and gifts. One of the critical differences between the very earliest versions of this tale and the one we get now is the centrality of the Silmarils. In the Book of Lost Tales, the Silmarils are perhaps the initial catalyst that gets the story moving, but they don't hold anywhere near the central significance they do in the final published Silmarillion. In the first, the Book of Lost Tales, they are more of the pebbles holding back the storm of stones in the avalanche, whereas in the Silmarillion themselves, they themselves are the avalanche. In the Silmarillion, they are the object of the crusade and the central focus of basically all events in the first age, and even trickling through the second and third and into the fourth. We see this in Sam's own mention of the continuation of the story of Beren and Luthien in the Pass of Cirith Ungol and the sighting of the Star of Earendil. Why are the Silmarils so important? What makes them such a draw? What gives them this power? Are they simply objects of great beauty, and therefore objects of great lust and great greed? That is one explanation, and perhaps the simplest. However, if we read of their making, there are a couple of interesting phrases here. Like the crystal of diamonds it appeared, and yet was more strong than adamant, so that no violence could mar or break it within the kingdom of Arda. Yet that crystal was to the Silmarils but as is the body to the children of Iluvatar, the house of its inner fire that is within it, and yet in all parts of it, and is its life. And the inner fire of the Silmarils Feanor made of the blended light of the trees of Valinor, which lives in them yet, though the trees have long withered and shine no more. Therefore, even in the darkness of the deepest treasury, the Silmarils of their own radiance shone like the stars of Arda, and yet as were they indeed living things, they rejoiced in light and received it and gave it back in hues more marvelous than before. There are many concepts tied up in that passage, one of which is the idea that the Silmarils may in fact be alive in some sense. If we recall from the Ainulindale, the primary source of life, of sentience, of the soul, is the secret fire which Iluvatar places at the center of the world. That is held within the center of the crystal shell of the Silmarils. And it is seen as a metaphor for the body and the soul of the Eldarin men. Are the Silmarils really alive? We can't truly answer that because we have the phrase, as were they indeed living things, which places it in doubt, which places it more as a simile. However, we can look at these statements and see why the Silmarils would draw Melkor. If you recall in the Ainulindale, one of Melkor's primary reasons for wanting to come to Arda is to claim ownership and have all for himself the flame imperishable, the secret fire. He is known as the Lord of Light, powers over fire and flame, and therefore determines light to be his own province. And if others will not let him claim lordship, they can't have it either. So there is a certain element of Melkor's own claim of ownership playing into his lust for the Silmarils, because he lusts after light and he lusts after the flame imperishable. Also, from what we've seen with the two lamps in Elmarin in the beginning of time, the advent of light led to springtime in the world. All life began to flourish, to flower, to bloom, to bear leaf. All of nature has been essentially set to sleep by Yavanna in the farther reaches in Middle-earth. And really only where the light has reached in Valinor are things truly alive in terms of the natural world. What would happen then if the light of the trees, which are life givers by the virtue of their light, were to be brought into the outer reaches of the world? Would there be a springtime of nature in that locale, and thereby give a certain level of power by their nature to the Silmarils? Granted, due to the greed, due to the selfish quality of Feanor's lust, we never see that exemplified. Same too for when Melkor has them. However, we do see some element of this when the Silmaril is born by Luthien. And it leads to an increase of her beauty and vitality, and an increase to the beauty of the land in which they live, but it also leads to them dying a much sooner death. The other argument to be made for the reason the Silmarils become the crux of the story is that they are made to be important because of the importance that the characters put in them. Feanor becomes enthralled by his creation. He can't let them go. And we talked about the nature of artists and that sometimes there's a certain level of yourself that goes into the work such that you can't let it go out into the world, that there's always a certain level of ownership or level of tinkering or wanting closeness or continued labor on it to be there. There's also the fact that the Valar have blessed, Varda has blessed the Silmarils, making them holy, making them such that any impure character cannot touch them, or they'll be burnt. Is the level of importance that these characters place on the Silmarils part of the reason why they take such a central role? Perhaps. Now, what this led to was a fascinating discussion on the nature of the relationship between the created and the creator, the artist and the work. When an artist works, they place part of themselves in the work. Their frustrations, their joys, their emotions end up being expressed in that work. What if perhaps the Silmarils took on, unconsciously on the part of Feanor, aspects of his character? What if this lust for knowledge, this avarice, this need for position and love and attention from his father were built into the Silmarils by virtue of their creation by Feanor? Not necessarily on the level of Sauron implanting himself in the ring, but perhaps there to some degree. Because when we look at the Silmarils and how they function and how they lead to tragedy, the primary mechanism of that tragedy are exactly those elements: greed, lust, a need for power, subjugation over other people. Is this work, are the Silmarils, a sort of proto-ring of power? Do perhaps these three stones prefigure the rings to come? Sauron has been living still in Valinor at this time, perhaps before his corruption. Might he have witnessed the creation of the Silmarils, or at least their after effects? Might he have understood this mechanism and filed it away for later use? Perhaps. And thereby, Feanor truly becomes, in a sense, the most calamitous of all characters, bringing about the tragedies of the first, second, and third ages. It's little wonder, then, why, when he dies before the coming of the sun, he is held in Mandos until the end of time. We were joking about the idea that you wouldn't want to let Feanor back out of Mandos into another elf who could potentially wreak as much havoc again. And joking that it would be akin to releasing the Kraken, releasing calamity. And yet, you have to look at Feanor and wonder, why? Why is he the way he is? Why does he act the way he does? And the reality is, he is a pitiable character. He lost his mother at a very young age. And his father remarried. And even though it is stated over and over again, and the actions of Finwë show that Feanor is the favorite, Feanor doesn't see it. He sees rather that his father married another and had 2 children, 2 sons, who vie for his position of love within his father's heart. It makes you wonder, if Finwë had not remarried, had not had more children, would the Silmarils have been made? Would they have been made in the same spirit? Would the calamities which follow have occurred? Perhaps. Because to some degree, Feanor's issues begin with the death of his mother and the loss of that feminine and balancing influence. In large part, that's why he marries Nerdinel, because Nerdinel encompasses a lot of those feminine qualities which would have balanced him that his mother had. And it's likely he still would have married her, regardless of whether his father remarried. And that really the moment which is so incredibly formative for him is more the loss of his mother than the addition of his half-brothers. Now we had to look at this and wonder, is there an element of autobiographical writing on Tolkien's part? Is this in part looking at the nature of his own childhood? The loss of his father at a very young age. Coming to England with his mother and being scorned by his mother's family for their faith. Even later in his professional as well as literary career, being scorned for his own beliefs and views on the nature of myth, and then on the nature or seriousness of his writing. Is that perhaps what we see here in the character of Feanor? Some of that sense of betrayal, some of that sense of a longing, a burning longing to create, and feeling not understood. Perhaps. But we have to continue with the Silmarillion with that in mind, with the notion of questioning who Feanor really is. Is he truly someone who's just so utterly corrupted that he is fallen so far from grace that everything he touches essentially withers away? Or is he simply a dupe? Is he someone who has essentially stumbled into mistake after mistake after mistake, and due to the prominence of his position, it just explodes? We don't know. We also have to think in terms of the nature of the Silmarils. Are they simply objects of great beauty? Do they have some allure or power of effect? Not necessarily sentient or truly alive, but able to instill in their bearer something of Feanor, something of that avarice, something of that thirst for dominance, for preeminence, which we see so often tied with those who go after them. How do we see this thraldom, which really is central to the plot? Not only thraldom to an oath, or thraldom to Melkor, but thraldom to a desire, to an appetite, to a greed, to a need for prominence and place, which is truly the downfall of the Noldor. Even those that we usually look upon more positively, namely those of the line of Fingolfin and Finarfin. They too are enthralled. And that is something that we need to continue to keep in mind. Because though the House of Feanor is looked upon very negatively in the text, is it all on them? Is it on the Valar? Or is it a corruption all the way around? It is something we're going to have to keep in mind. Join us next time as we reach the pivotal moment where all of this comes to a head, where we see the true meaning and import of the importance that at least Feanor places on the Silmarils. We'll be reading The Darkening of Valinor. I hope you'll meet with us then and discuss all of these and more then. As one of our members likes to say, it's always an amazing thing to get together and discuss Tolkien, because we're always going to find something we'd never thought of before. And it's an amazing thing when you can do that with a book that you've read countless numbers of times. I hope to see you then.